Oh my God. What am I doing? Hi, everybody. Welcome to Just Thinking Out Loud. My name is Desi-Rae. I'm speaking today with Rebecca Gould. She is a professor of Islamic and Comparative Literature at the University of Birmingham. And
Correct.
she's working on the intersections of literary, political, and legal theory. I found her because I was doing my piece on the Vox apocalypse, and I really enjoyed her take on drawing a distinction between hate speech and expressing views, and that hate speech is different from what was it? Words that harm are different
Words that
from.
offend.
Say that again. Sorry.
Words that offend.
Words that offend are different from words
Right.
that harm. So that is how I found her, and I also would like for her to introduce herself to you as well, so you
Sure.
can know where she's coming from. Hi.
Hello, Desiree. Thank you so much for the invitation. Yes, so I work on many different aspects of culture, past and present, but I've become increasingly interested in issues of free speech and hate speech. I might mention, I don't know where most of your viewers come from, but I'm American by background and sort of transplanted to the UK. And I think that's maybe part of the origin of my interest in this topic because they're, in many ways, UK and the United States are very similar, certainly on superficial levels. But after living in the UK for maybe 3 or 4 years, I was really struck by a difference in attitudes to free speech. And so I've sort of learned a lot. In fact, I've learned a lot about American approaches by looking at it from a UK perspective and vice versa. And so I think my angle on this topic is very much shaped by my awareness of that. I was really so that sort of made it a contemporary issue for me. But yes, I work on many different topics, mostly to do with sort of the Islamic world in a very broad sense.
Okay. Uh, I want to talk about specifically about the IHR definition stuff. But first
Hmm.
of all, could you describe what are the differences between
Yes,
the approach to
sure.
speech between America and the UK?
Sure. Well, the obvious big difference is the First Amendment, right, which exists which is foundational for certainly jurisprudence in the United States for the past 100 years, and is often linked to the U.S.'s traditionally very wide berth given to controversial, offensive, even racist speech. Right? It's not legal to ban racist speech, for example, in the U.S. The contrast in the UK, and it's not only about not having a First Amendment. There isn't, in fact, a written constitution in the UK. So the legal situation is very different. But and people just there isn't a First Amendment right, for example, to make racist statements. So there is a sense where if someone crosses a line between over, say beyond what is accepted that they should be saying, then can be consequences for their employment, for their whatever kind of professional status they have, and that's accepted as part of the way things should work in a liberal democracy in the UK. Now, so I think legally it's a very different situation. But I think as anyone who's sort of been closely watching the U.S. situation might notice, is that the free speech ideals, are not always adhered to, right? So I think I do think a lot of the issues, the similar issues arise, right? There's all kinds of constant violations of free speech in the United States, but there is a legal framework for pushing back against it. Whereas in the UK, I mean, there's the European Court of Human Rights has some sort of broad wording about protecting freedom of expression, but it's not nearly as consequential as in the U.S. So there's just a different framework for kind of defending free speech rights.
Right. I mean, I never really thought about it. I know that in the UK they have common law, but I never really thought about the fact that there isn't a constitution with amendments
Right.
that you can point to
Hmm.
and say, hey, this is our right as a citizen of this country. I hadn't really thought about it. So that's a good point. I want to point out to my listeners or viewers that Rebecca, at least in her Twitter, did describe herself as a non-aligned leftist. I think that might be important because for a lot of my audience, I'm not sure what they are, but I think they're slightly right wing or libertarian. That's what I would
Uh-huh.
describe them as,
Interesting.
but I'm not actually sure. It's just the kind of
Right.
people who are attracted to my content. And now I want to specifically talk about your work on the IHRE. which stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and their new definition of anti-Semitism, and your thoughts on that. And by the way, Rebecca has a great Twitter thread that's pinned to her profile. It's 16 tweets long. I thought it was awesome, and I wish more people could see it. Like, you just talk about
thank
like
you
your
so
work
much.
on that. You're welcome.
Right. And I guess I could share my Twitter handle. It's very easy to remember, RGOULD. So that's easy to find. Happy to hear from people. By the way, yes, just on that point that you made is interesting about sort of right wing or libertarian followers. I think, but you also take a deep interest in free speech. And so it's interesting. Right. I was certainly, for me, and I certainly do identify as a leftist, but I identify as a leftist who is different, certainly in the sense of caring about free speech. So I'm very interested to know why it is that we live in a moment when it seems that it's become associated with a certain political leaning, whereas it really shouldn't be, because it's a basic human right for everyone. But anyway, that's another conversation. Okay, so yes, I can give you a lot of background about the Desi-Rae definition, which is really in a negative sense, transformed politics in the UK context. Particularly, anyone who follows UK politics will know about sort of the Labour Party has been under constant pressure to adopt this definition. So backtrack a little bit. It's a definition that actually has been around for a while. For about maybe a decade or so. And basically it has to do with how we think about what is anti-Semitism, how we define it. The sources, the sort of historical motivation for it originally, which I think is not, it's perfectly understandable. There was concern, I guess this was in the 1990s in Germany. There was a concern that certain hate crimes were not being classified as anti-Semitic when they were. So, for example, if a synagogue was attacked, Jewish communities were concerned that there was a kind of hesitance on the part of the police to classify that as a hate crime. So the problem, I think, is a real problem, something we should acknowledge as an issue. That I do support hate crimes being classified as hate crimes, right, and kind of having a specific focus on punishing them and stopping them. But I also support free speech without limits, basically. So, yes. So the solution, I think, was problematic, which was that anti-Semitism was sort of redefined as being. Well, there's a whole series. You could look it up on the website. It's, I think it's easy to, if you Google it, you'll find the website immediately. But there's basically a very short definition, which it's just very vague, saying that it's anti-Semitism is the treating hostility towards Jews or those who are perceived as Jews. I mean, there are better definitions around, but it's not quite as unhelpful or problematic as the examples that are given. And these also have kind of been incorporated into, so it's been adopted now. It's being adopted by governments. The UK government has adopted this definition. Okay. And one example, so it's not a law. And this is also part of the whole confusing thing of it. It's not a law because when you adopt a definition, a government, at least a democracy, does not, that you have to go through a parliament. Right. But it has policy implications, and there are certainly people who would like to make it a law. So some of the problematic examples, for example, there's a clause saying sort of denying the Jewish people the right of self-determination is an example of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's very focused on speech. Right. And it's overwhelmingly, whereas there are actually synagogues are being burnt, people are being physically harmed, attacked, but that is not the focus of how this definition defines anti-Semitism. So it's very strange. But it's also somehow symptomatic. I mean, there's a lot, as you can imagine, particularly for people involved in the sort of Palestine-Israel debate, there's a lot of sort of specific focus about how awful this definition is, and I support that view. But what really struck me when I was sort of looking at, I was asking myself, like, how did any government or any really rational, sane person come around to kind of accepting something like this as useful or helpful? And what I started noticing, and I think this is a bit different maybe from other colleagues who are opposed to the definition like I am, I started noticing it's actually very similar to speech codes in the United States. And that's where I see the origin of this definition. So, for example, in the 90s, 1980s, 1990s, for different kinds of racisms, right? There was a turn in, especially on university campuses, to ban certain kinds of racist speech. And at this point, anti-Semitism wasn't part of the conversation. It was just saying things that people found offensive, anti-women speech and so forth, and just banning it, right? So excluding students from dorm rooms, and it was part of a law school, there was a legal movement around this called critical race theory. And I started looking at the way in which there was this assumption that if we just ban offensive speech, we'll get rid of the problem of racism. And that's where I see the IHRA definition. That's where I see the origins. Now, of course, that's a controversial thing to say simply because a lot of the people who were involved in the critical race theory movement were very much, they define themselves as leftists, liberals, and they themselves would oppose something like the IHRA definition because that's associated with sort of right-wing Zionism and supporting the state of Israel, which those two things don't often go together, right? But I see a similar in both movements. There's a similar focus on the problem being offending, offensive speech. And also what's interesting is that this IHRA definition, and particularly those who promote it, insist that the only person who has the right to decide what is or is not anti-Semitic is a Jewish person, and specifically a Jewish person who identifies with the state of Israel. Which, I mean, if you sort of personalize the definition of racism in that subjective way, and you give that a legal force, chaos can result. So that's something also that kind of, it's like identity, and there's a real focus on identity, a person's identity as giving them a special authority to not just to kind of decide what's offensive, but actually in this case to decide what's legal and not. So the UK was one of the first governments in the world to adopt that, and it really changed. I mean, it has changed certainly the politics or even just discussions in the UK, especially on university campuses. Events were canceled because they were seen as it being in violation of the definition. If the idea was, if they didn't include a pro-Israeli perspective, then they might be in violation. Actually, one university said of the law, which was a flawed interpretation, but it did happen. In fact, I'm going to an event Sunday. It's called Pal Expo, Palestinian Expo, and it's just an event about Palestinian events. And a group of lawyers is now trying to get it canceled based on this definition. They're making legal threats, and so I don't. So on the one hand, I certainly see myself as aligning with the Palestinian cause and so on, but I don't want to reduce it to that. I think this is something that certainly conservatives should care about. And even as I try to argue, I think people who are supportive of Israel should also care about it, because this isn't the way to win an ideological battle, by silencing your opponent. So it's a complicated introduction.
Yeah, no, that was great. So there are a couple of things you touched on about people focusing on speech versus actual acts of violence, and also about someone who has a certain identity being given special authority to define what hatred against them is. So I kind of want to talk about that, but I looked up online. I went to HolocaustRemembrance.com while you were talking, because I was trying to find this definition.
Great.
There's a PDF that's posted 26th of May 2016. Is that the correct?
That's it.
One?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
and
that's the one.
They have in big bold letters that they would like to adopt the following non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. I just want the people listening to hear. So in quotes, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. That's end quote. And then they have some examples to serve as illustrations. I won't go through them, but the PDF is at HolocaustRemembrance.com. And before we keep talking, I just want to point out a bit of my own background. Is that I grew up in Jamaica, and there isn't really much talk about Jews or anti-Semitism or any of that. So a lot of this stuff was something I had to kind of pick up peripherally, hearing people talk about it. I only really knew that the Holocaust happened and there was Hitler. That was pretty much it.
Wow.
That's because most of Caribbean history is about slavery, and that's the kind of stuff they focus on. They don't necessarily focus on this stuff. So it's interesting to me, like hearing people talk about something that I'm not so familiar with, and then I can also relate it back to, my own experience being like an immigrant, a dark-skinned person, and that kind of stuff. But they do point out in this definition rhetorical and physical manifestations. So
Yes, absolutely. So absolutely, and it's not the case that every single word of that document I disagree with. It's not, they mention Holocaust denial, which I think is a huge. I mean, it's not necessarily numerically huge, but it's certainly a classic example of anti-Semitism. There's nothing to be said. There's no way to defend that, right? So it's
right.
certainly the right to point that out is awful. But it's a question of emphasis, right? So of their 11 examples, 7 of them are about Israel. And if the goal is to sort of really focus on harm, on actual and not to violate to abridge free speech, that's not really the way to go, right? I think you could say overall there is a turn towards we could say criminalization, even though it does say non-legally binding. The contextual point is that it's being used as if it were a law. So there's an overall trend towards a criminalization of speech, which again, to the point about being from Jamaica, I think it's good to engage with this, because I sort of my goal here is not, as in my involvement in this issue, is not to kind of demonize the specific definition. I see it as part of a broader phenomenon, and I don't want to reduce it to this one thing. It's just that it's I think it's the mystery for me. I think everyone I talk to, we've been sort of following this slowly and thinking, okay, like this isn't really the best definition out there. Why is it being embraced by so many people? And I think that the explanation for that cannot be reduced to just what's happening in terms of anti-Semitism. It has to do with a broader cultural attitude and a cultural desire to focus on speech as a source of harm, while not focusing on harmful acts.
Right. And can you talk a bit more about why is it that governmental agencies are trying to adopt a certain definition when this definition seems to have just been what gives this group the special authority to say that we can then influence the legal system of a country? That seems very strange that that would be allowed, or is people are trying to make that happen?
Sure. It's complicated, and could be a very controversial question. There are many ways in which that could be answered. Obviously, some people would point to the role of the state of Israel. I don't want to reduce it to that at all. But yeah, it's impossible to divorce from international politics. If the countries that have adopted this definition are the countries that are declared themselves to be in support of Israeli policies. So it's certainly a geopolitical question. Just for clarity, the U.S. position, the State Department has adopted it. And I don't. Again, there wouldn't really be a procedure through which the whole government can adopt a definition, because it doesn't exist. And for First Amendment reasons, also, it would be shot down immediately. It just couldn't be possible. But I think that's probably the most the most obvious answer is just that this is a definition that is tries to make certain criticisms of the state of Israel. So I think one example in that definition of anti-Semitism is disproportionate criticism or double standards, right? The application of double standards to the state of Israel. That's an example of anti-Semitism. And, I think maybe that could be true in some cases, but it's just a question of whether it's useful to put that in a kind of criminal law framework.
Right.
But yeah, so that's that there is an alignment between the foreign policy of governments and the adoption of that definition. It's also, but in the UK specifically, there is a tendency to kind of propose definitions of racism as a solution to racism. That's been happening for a while.
Right.
It goes back to there was an inquiry into a particularly awful case of police ignoring a racist murder, and there's sort of this took place at the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, it's called, in the 1990s, and so this took, again, what's a lot of these solutions, which I think are really problematic, actually arise from really serious problems. So I don't want to downgrade the problem. It was a terrible thing that happened, that someone was murdered and the police ignored it because apparently he was black, and so sort of the British government, British public tried to sort of did some soul searching, and the solution that they came up with was that the people who have the authority to define what is racist are those who, so it's just that those who are victims of it, or those who perceive themselves to be victims of it, and I think that's been, that's been really abused in the UK context, that idea, and but I think it's particularly been problematic in the case of anti-Semitism, because if you look at the cases of who's been targeted, who's been called anti-Semitic, it's mostly Jews, right? Mostly Jews who are criticized.
Right.
It's overwhelmingly, and so that's where identity gets complicated, right? Because everyone's multiple things.
Yeah, I have a real issue with this, if you're of a certain identity, you have authority to define things like that, because for me, this is something I always say, is that the experience of offense isn't universal. Like, what you would consider offense isn't. And I also think that you're talking about most of the people who are labeled as anti-Semitic are actually Jews, and those people would have the most, I think, desire to criticize, because they're trying to reform the group that they identify with. They're trying to make them better. So it's almost, it just doesn't make sense. And I completely disagree with the idea that whether or not something is offensive or can be defined as hate speech against a particular group can be watered down, or not watered, can be pinned on one person's opinion of it, because that person's opinion is always going to be subjective. And that, it seems like you have to come up with some kind of standard framework that can be maybe not completely, but way more universal than hinging on, I identify as, so I get to decide that this hurts or offends me.
Absolutely. I think the last show that I saw, you were talking about how it's about power and control, right? And I think that's true. I mean, in the UK context, you asked, so why would it happen? I mean, it's a great PR move for governments to say that they're dealing with the problem of racism. I mean, that's how it's been playing out. And so, the Conservative Party wanted to show that it was sort of above, doing better than the Labour Party. And then there's a competition between which party is going to adopt this definition. Right. So it's become a PR strategy. Yeah,
that's a real issue I have with politics in the U.S. is, as I understand it, I think I'm more pissed off by the left, just because, yes, they were for what you call very serious issues, but then they use it, in my opinion, as a tool for PR purposes. But I also think the right is very much capable of doing the exact same thing, and then it just becomes this battle of who is
who's more
going to solve this issue of racism or hate, like, against groups, and it's just, I think, silly. But it also, I don't think, will ever really go away, because there are also real issues that people are having, that people are trying to solve. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but it's definitely not the government trying to standardize solutions with, I guess, their programs, and in the process eliminating certain liberties that people, I think, naturally deserve to have, even if in some countries, like countries outside of the U.S., don't recognize that legally yet.
Absolutely. I always wonder, one of my dreams is if one day, I see the media, I think particularly in terms of the anti-Semitism, and there's been a tremendous amount of misreporting. If one day the media just decided that they were not going to cover stories about someone being outraged by something, there are just no more stories about this, because it dominates everything when there's such more significant things happening in the world. And I feel like it brainwashes people, to thinking of this is the news, that some person said some offensive thing to someone and then they responded to that offensive thing. What if the media just stopped allowing those narratives to control our lives, and we started focusing on, like, things that actually, people dying?
I mean, that's a difficult question to answer, because I find myself caught up in it too, and I think we all do. But how can you ignore it when it's turning into, like you're saying, legal stuff? Because it's like, if you ignore it, then it just gets worse. It's like
Yeah,
you want to just reframe the conversation, but you have to be on the defensive, or else it's just gonna keep
exactly. Yeah.
pushing forward. So
Hmm.
it's a difficult thing. I wanted to ask you to go a bit more broader
Sure.
in terms of this, because I have here in my notes for this talk some of your
Hmm.
quotes. So I'll just read. It's a little bit taken out of context. It's from your tweets, but
Uh-huh.
I have two things. One where you say humans, as political beings, will never agree on the most basic issues, so we must organize ourselves politically in the expectation and hope of constant disagreement. That's one thing you said. And another thing you said was there is no dichotomy between tolerance and free speech. We do not need to balance these values against each other. Instead,
Right.
we need to begin by respecting difference and by distinguishing between words that offend and acts that harm. Can you just talk more about that?
Absolutely, yes. So I think that was directly coming out of a UK context where it's all about balance. We're always taught, I mean, as professors in particular, that, or professors who write, who are sometimes I do write controversial things that people have been offended by, and they said so long it's okay to do that so long as you balance out this free speech rights with tolerance. But I think that's a very problematic view of both of those things, because in a democracy, you should be embracing difference, and it's not about. I mean, there's something kind of dictatorial about this idea of just being silent in the presence of difference. Why not engage with that and embrace it, and think about democracy as something that requires that kind of difference? It's not just about. I mean, I also lived in Singapore, which has many wonderful qualities to it, but I don't think it's a model for free speech. And that's a place where there's a lot of tolerance. People are very, very. If they disagree, they just won't say it. I don't. But I think people are also very unhappy for that reason. So.
Right.
So yeah, the American, I guess, at some level was coming out in me. Though America's certainly a problematic place in other ways, but I think that's a really unhelpful. It's a sort of dichotomy that underwrites traditional liberal approaches to free speech, but it's something that it's so limiting, right? If the whole point of having free speech is so that we can have difference flourish, not so that we can sort of put silos around it. And in terms of the distinction between harm and acts that harm and words that offend, I mean, that's just an argument from jurisprudence that there is definitely a trend within the EU, within the UK, within the US, probably not so much, again, because of the First Amendment, but to blur these distinctions. And I think that's not the way to. What that's going to do is just going to suppress differences. It's not going to create like what really should be the vision of what some might call classical liberal vision, or classical democratic vision of difference, where people, it's not that people all have to be the same, it's that they can actually, that their disagreement is part of what makes democracy.
Yeah, you're touching on suppression of speech, and the reason why I actually found you was that I was trying to find examples of there are people who are, I think, influential for large tech companies who have said that people being able to discuss certain things amongst themselves has resulted in the radicalization of our individuals to the right wing. And I was trying to say,
Mm-hmm.
well, couldn't that also happen in the other direction as well? And I think you were coming up with some paper or something that isn't finished yet, from what I think I was trying to find on your page. Something about that, because I think that everything is framed in terms of not everything, like the people I listen to know, but just say tech companies, they frame most
Mm-hmm.
things as extremism towards the right because they're so concerned about racism, which they perceive as being on the right, which I don't agree with, but that's
Mm-hmm.
what they do. So don't you think that this also goes the other way? And don't you think, I think, and maybe you do, you don't have to think this as well, that radicalization can also occur on the opposite end of the spectrum, one, and that also radicalization can occur because you are trying to diminish differences and suppress differences, because nobody's really researching that, while a lot of research is going on to, well, because you talk about it, you get radicalized. But I think because you don't talk about it, you also become
absolutely
radicalized.
Yeah. I think there's no question about that. I mean, this sort of martyr complex that most the perpetrators of violent acts do see themselves as martyrs. I mean, that's part of it. They're all, I'm thinking of, like, say, the Christchurch massacre or
Right.
Breivik and so on. I mean, they're racist, and that's true. But I think they also see themselves as martyrs and heroes, and I think the media narrative, in a sense, that not that I want to celebrate that, but I mean, there's a certain media narrative that feeds into that that they thrive on, actually. So yeah, there's a lot of empirical research, I think, to show that censorship is it glorifies, it makes certain views actually somehow seem exciting and thrilling and appealing. So I and it hasn't. It's interesting how people have been willing to adopt, say, definitions of anti-Semitism, or to take measures to suppress speech without really going to the trouble to look into the question of, is this actually, can you actually trace this to a hate crime? Often they can't. And there's just isn't that much effort. It's assumed, right? It's part of our sort of cultural baggage that this is words cause harm, and but once you start doing that, and the dangers of where do you stop? Where do you draw the line? I mean, there's no you begin with, say, openly offensive statements, and then controversial statements, and then just unappealing statements.
Right.
It becomes very blurry.
You were saying that the U.S. it's not so much in the U.S., but I do think I have seen a trend towards people wanting to blur those lines.
Absolutely.
I think maybe it will take a really long time to pass because of the U.S. First Amendment, but I think it's possible. I think that people are so caught up in what I would call the known sources of violent acts. So we're very able to be like, oh, this is going to result in anti-Semitism or racism against Black people because we know that this has happened in the past. And so I think that blinds people to other, like, how they can be recreating the issue because they're trying to stamp it out to the point where these ideas cannot exist. And I don't think you can remove those ideas that you don't like from the world. I think that's completely unrealistic. I mean, I think, I'm not saying it could never happen, but it is unlikely, especially because I think that racial past or anti-Semitic past is very recent. So you still have those ideas floating around, and I almost think that by trying to get rid of it completely, you're actually just, you're drawing attention back. So...
Absolutely. And I think another thing people don't think about when they advocate for these kinds of rules is that every law or every regulation, even not even just law, it empowers authorities who often have a history of the very kinds of racism and discrimination that we're fighting against. I mean, it's a very, I think, people don't quite realize that can actually become dangerous. It empowers, like, a good example is this prevent legislation. It's called in the U.S. or sorry, the UK context. It's kind of a parallel to the, what's it called, National Security Patriot Act in the U.S. Where some groups, they embrace it because they think it'll help. I mean, some even Muslim groups think it's supposed to sort of counter terrorism, but it really focuses on whether or not, and viewpoints, right? And so if someone has a kind of problematic viewpoint, then is it going to come to the government's attention? And it's sort of divided the Muslim community, but I think most Muslims feel that it's increased surveillance, it increased the control of the government over them. And what's interesting is that there's been a sort of response to the IHRA definition. Certain Muslim groups, I would say particularly Muslim groups that have closer relations to the government, have advocated for a definition of Islamophobia. But this definition of Islamophobia is supposed to protect Muslims also embraces the surveillance,
Right.
of Muslims. And so there are a lot of them who don't like it, but you can see the problems that are springing up. I mean, I think that the division, just as there's a kind of a fine line when you start blurring the distinctions between words that offend and words that harm. That's something we need to be really aware of. There's once you start promoting the protection of certain groups, I think one should be aware that you're also, by implication, promoting their surveillance, right? And that's what's happening in the UK. So yeah, we need to be aware of who are we putting power, whose power are we increasing when we start regulating things. And yeah, what has been happening in the UK, it's not been. I mean, it's been in the name of promoting equality and peace, but that's not been the reality. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I have a fundamental distrust of the government. So even if I think there are individuals within the government who are trying to do something they think is good, I don't trust the machine. So
Right.
I would never, myself personally, wouldn't want to go to the government to solve those issues. Like the reason why people have gone to the government in the past, I think, and currently is because government was being used to oppress certain groups. And so it's like you want to reverse those things. But at the same time, that's exactly why you shouldn't trust the government, because
exactly. Yeah. There's this assumption that we've moved beyond that. There's a historical memory of a time when, say, even Europe or the United States, where government was oppressive, and there's this idea that we've moved beyond that, which just isn't realistic. The problems with the state, with state control, are going to be with us forever. I mean, in a sense, just like racism. So I, while I obviously support attempts to fight racism, I think that needs to be done in the awareness of who's getting the power.
Right. You touched very briefly on Muslims, and I wanted to talk a bit about Islamophobia, because that's another thing that I'm not very connected with. I haven't really talked about it on my channel because I don't think I understand it well enough.
Sure.
I do know that generally when you have groups, they tend to be labeled based off of the most extreme of their group, which is not fair. But I don't really understand. Could you talk about that in the context of speech, I guess, and hate
Absolutely.
and stuff?
So it's a very controversial term, and I mean, the term itself is problematic, but then so is a lot of terms, right? It's interesting that anti-Semitism, in fact, if one looks at the history of it, which is the word itself is also problematic. Anti-Semitism was originally, the word was coined by someone who was celebrating anti-Semitism. So he was saying anti-Semitism was a good thing, and now we use it anyway as an awful thing. But so with Islamophobia too, it's there's a big question mark over, is it legitimate to say that because by implication, if one talks about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, one is saying that it's wrong to oppose Islam, right? That's what the word itself seems to apply, and also the idea of phobia is kind of not. It doesn't necessarily get at what's wrong with racism, right? It's very focused on psychological issues. Right. So I do use the term because we do what we can with the language we have. But I think viewers should be aware that it's not necessarily a term that I think is great. I think anti-Muslim racism would be better because often hostility or even violence against Muslims is often, it does become a racialized issue. It's Muslims often from certain parts of the world and who look a certain way. But so I think it's a better way to talk about it. But on the other hand, we have to do what we can with the language that exists. So that's the first thing to be said about Islamophobia. And it's certainly, again, it's a case where I don't think there's much doubting that there is a problem. There were massacres taking place in mosques and so on. So something certainly needs to be done. I guess the debate is around what is the origin of that. Is it hatred of Muslims as Muslims and so forth? And again, the response that the UK has been taking place. The conversation in the UK is that we need to focus on. There's a government report was just issued that about sort of how to combat this challenge, because there was a mosque shooting recently. There have been cases of people being stabbed that were clearly driven by hatred of Muslims, hatred of Islam. And once again, I mean, the solution that's being proposed is all about speech and all about,
Right.
I mean, it's really funny that there's this definition of Islamophobia, which is fine. I mean, it's like a very short thing that says it's anti-Muslim racism. That's fine. But there is, I think, 11 examples. I mean, literally copying the IHRA definition, saying that, I mean, it's almost it would be comical if it was in reality, right?
Right, right.
And then it says, I mean, just as it's absurd, I think, to kind of criminalize viewpoints in the context of anti-Semitism. So to say that, denying Jewish people the right to self-determination is like anti-Semitism. It says in the context of Islamophobia that it's denying Kashmir, and there's all these kind of political conflicts that are brought into play, which just aren't relevant to someone who's about to be shot. I mean, it just doesn't explain. It explains very little, and yeah, so that's I think that definition was just proposed a few months ago, and everyone who is supporting it literally said we expect this to be adopted because of the IHRA definition is being adopted. So it's sort of a political game. I don't think, I mean, I don't see much coming of it concretely. It deflects discussion, over real issues.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I'm certainly Islamophobia is a problem, and there's no question about that. I guess the thing is, though, a government that surveils. I mean, I think we should begin with government surveillance and begin with the messages that surveillance passes on to everyday citizens, right? So if a woman comes in, for example, to a NHS, which is like the medical government medical institution in the UK, and she wears a veil, she's instructed by UK law, by this Prevent program, she should be sort of suspicious of her, and she should ask her whether she's being controlled by her husband. And so that's a kind of a viewpoint that's actually promoted by the government. So it doesn't make, it's a contradictory thing. If the government is going to promote that viewpoint, that we should be suspicious of people who dress like Muslims, then their efforts to fight Islamophobia are just not
right.
Who would believe that? So I think government should be held accountable in different ways. Not, I think we put so much emphasis on governments that how they need to kind of send the right message and make people happy and so on. But all I want is to be protected, to be kept from harm. And I think a lot of people, if government could achieve that,
right. Well,
I
think the government can sometimes achieve that, but the times when they won't and they might be the cause of harm, it's not worth it to me. But that gets into like fundamental political differences. There was something I wanted to ask what you were saying. Oh, about the Islamophobia versus anti-Muslim racism. Right, because when I first heard people calling Islamophobia racism, I remember thinking, but Islam or being Muslim, that's not a race. So I remember saying something like that. That's probably the most I ever said about it in public. Right. That seems like a quandary because I've never really heard the explanation that certain Muslims from certain places are maybe treated a certain way. And the only Muslims that I really are friends with are actually from the Caribbean. So they're not even the typical Muslim anyway. Sure. I don't know anything about, that stuff.
Yeah. So I do. I mean, I think that's absolutely. There's no. Yeah. Say a Somali Muslim in the UK is going to have a very different experience than a German Muslim. There's no question about that. I guess the justification. So I think anti-Muslim racism helps as a category, or thinking of it as racism helps as a category. The justification for kind of keeping Islam as the common denominator is that often these beliefs are. I mean, they're projected onto on the view, say ISIS, whatever ISIS is doing in Iraq is projected onto someone from Somalia. And so that category is, in a sense, it's created from the outside. It's not so much from within.
Yeah, it sounds complicated because, ISIS is doing things in the name of Islam. However, they cannot be used as the representative for all of people who follow Islam. So it's very difficult to to piece that apart. And I do think that people who criticize Islam in this way, like looking at, say, the extreme versions of it, have to be very careful, as with any other groups, of making sure to draw that distinction pretty much every single time they talk about it. I guess that's what I have to say about that. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think it should be focused. I mean, it's more productive to think of Islamophobia in terms of racism, not something that's kind of an ideological battle that needs to be fought, to defend certain perspectives, or it's just that people, every human being, has the right to be treated as an equal citizen and to be free from discrimination and not to be a target of violence. And so there's no question that Muslims are disproportionately targets of violence in the UK. That's statistically well established. So I do support efforts to challenge that, but I guess I do worry that the direction that's taking is not helpful for Muslims. I mean, there's a case in Vienna. It was a very controversial case. Not Vienna. The European Court of Human Rights had a ruling recently that defended. Again, this was seen as a kind of protection of Islam in some ways. There was a woman in Vienna from Austria, Austrian woman who had been engaging. She's sort of she would define herself as someone on the right wing, associate of Geert Wilders, I believe, and was saying, things about Muhammad being a pedophile and so on, stuff that I think, doesn't have any scholarly foundation. I'm certainly not going to defend it, but I also think it was very bad, very, very unhelpful, I should say, to Muslims that the European Court of Human Rights ruled that she'd committed a crime. The blasphemy
because of what she said. Oh, okay, right. Of course,
Muhammad
what she
a pedophile.
Said. Right.
That was an example of blasphemy. And what's so interesting there is that they use a sort of Christian law, Christian tradition of outlawing certain kinds of anti-Christian speech. So blasphemy laws, really, that was what was activated. It was the Vienna court, so the Austrian court,
right,
did this. And I mean, as you say, in fairness, she didn't have to serve a prison sentence. It was just a fine of something like 500 euros. But her speech was criminalized, and of course, right. You can imagine what she's doing with this.
I mean, I don't really blame her, but I remember seeing there was something on Twitter about a museum covering art because some Muslims were offended by it. I remember seeing that. I was like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
I remember thinking that.
And it's also important. I mean, the whole question of representation comes in because, of course, there are as with any group, there are some Muslims who are against offensive expression, but there are lots of Muslims who don't care,
right,
who are totally happy with democracy and with different points of view. And so just letting that one vocal slice dominate the conversation, that also contributes to Islamophobia.
Yeah. That really bothers me about when people talk about racism against Black people in the U.S. And I mean, I've only been here for like eight years now, so a good amount of time. But I also know people who've been here their whole life, and they also feel the same way I do. And you just can't use, like you said, the most vocal minority as representative of the rest of the group. And that's the issue just with all this identity stuff, is like you can't universalize these things. I wanted to ask you if you had any solutions, like what would be a better direction of trying to reduce like hate crimes, if any. I don't know if this is something that can even be solved by like the government and laws and stuff. Like I don't know if it's not them reversing some law where they're already say like Jim Crow laws or something in the past where it's the government doing it and they're trying to reel back. I'm not sure that the government can enact laws to change hatred within people. And do you know of any actual evidence of something that would work, which controlling speech, there is no evidence that would actually help reduce racism, even though they're behaving as if there is, or assuming?
Okay. Big question. So, I mean, I can think of a few things, and it's not all necessarily up to the government. I agree. But I think the curriculum, looking at the school curriculums, looking at, educating people. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's not. It's also true, right? People who have some awareness and knowledge of cultures beyond their own are much less likely. I mean, they are not going to commit hate crimes. They're much less likely, at the very least, like minimally, right? I think it's making people aware. I even think of my own education when I look back on it as an American student. It was biased in many ways, and maybe that's where my leftism is coming in a bit. But I mean, I don't think I was taught how to. I certainly I was told, oh, it's not polite to say offensive things to people, but I mean, how to really respect people from different cultures and not to kind of glorify my own. That's not been part of my education. I mean, I think in general, governments, states, don't think they have to instill pride in their citizenry, and that's the first priority. I think instead, I mean, let's try to move into a world where that's not the first priority. Let's educate people to be humble about where they come from and not assume they're the best just because of their culture or their nationality or their race or whatever. And I do think that educations in general are not at the primary school level. They still tend to instill a lot of racist ideas. I mean, not in any kind of direct way, but it doesn't open minds. So that's one. Yeah, that's one place I would start. They don't learn about, say, colonialism in the British school system, for example. It's still taught a controversial subject, whereas it's controversial to talk about colonialism, but their solution to kind of tolerance is to make racism outlawed. I mean, I think they should just allow people to say their thoughts. And so education, and I think that the media, I think all forms should be permitted, but I think the media should be also try to educate a little bit and not just sort of seek the most exciting headlines. And
I think the media is focused more on slander than resolution. That's
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, of course it's for commercial reasons. So that's a challenge. I mean, that's a real, how do you keep government out of it while at the same time improving the quality of what's available is a challenging question. But I do think if the media had a kind of awakening and just try to actually, just not slander, not focus on outrage, focus on things that matter. I mean, I know I struggle so much as a citizen, just to kind of not have just to find good coverage that doesn't pollute, it's really hard. And that even applies to organizations I respect. So I don't know. And I don't think that doesn't also mean I don't think their government like the BBC, I don't think they do a very good job either. So I do think that would make a huge difference. I mean, how to bring that about in a democratic way I mean, maybe, some wonderful rich person can, because we have a lot of, corporate people who control the media, I think, who are doing unhelpful things with the media, right? Promoting certain kinds of messages. It would be nice if someone who with a great vision did try to do the same. I don't see that happening, but I think that would make a difference. It's not necessarily something I'm prescribing for government to do, but I think it would make a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. So education, media, those are the main things. And criminalizing, I do think, adding when something is clearly a hate crime. I mean, one example I could give is where in the city that I live in, Bristol, there was a case of an Iranian refugee. It's a terrible story. He was burned alive because he was kind of seen as an outsider, and it was just the racism. I mean, people just watched, and apparently this took place about 3 years ago.
Who was burning him alive?
So just his neighbor. He was in what's called council housing. Like a housing project.
Right.
He was he'd been complaining to the police about one of his neighbors. I guess his neighbor had been accusing him of pedophilia because he had a learning disability, and so his behavior was a bit unusual. This neighbor, who was of course white and I'm sure just not very well educated, was spreading rumors about this refugee, this guy. I guess he, for example, he would sit in his room and look out at the window, and he said that he was a whatever.
How
I mean, it
does
was
that? I don't see
nonsense.
how it connects just because you're a bit odd. Like they're
I know. Well, but people, that's the point, is that people make these assumptions about other
right,
people, right? When they whatever have whatever's going on in their head. But I
right.
mean, I guess what's significant is that this Iranian refugee, he'd complained to the police several times. He said, I think I'm going to be attacked. I'm afraid, because
Oh
it kept
no.
threatening him. And the police just laughed it off. They said one time they searched his computer for pedophilic material because he'd been accused of it. They didn't find anything, so they sent him back home.
Oh.
And then, like, the next day, he was torched alive. But wait, this is an example. I was saying, oh yeah, oh wait, so I mean, but the racism was there from the beginning. The evidence was there from the beginning. They could have done something, but they didn't. And so I think that it is, if the government does send a message that, the idea that you're targeting people because of their skin color and you're committing acts of violence, there's no mercy for that, no space for that. Then yeah, I mean, I think it's a message that the government, that's one of the good necessary roles of the
So
state, right, to not allow that.
what happened to that guy who, I guess, burned
Good
his
question.
neighbor?
Yeah. So I mean, of course, the person who was burned alive died.
Right.
The person who did it, he got a relatively weak sentence. So, I mean, something like 20 years. I think 15 years.
Okay.
And he was given like special, and I mean, it was not recognized as a hate crime. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of horrific, but I for whatever reason, I mean, the government hesitates to kind of there's always some kind of, I don't know, like, he was young, he was 25 or something, so there are all kinds, he had a family thing, excuses were made for him, basically,
For burning a man alive? I don't understand how you can make excuses for that.
Yeah, exactly. I don't either. And meanwhile, the government is sending the message, oh yeah, we're fighting racism because we're anyone who gets offended, gets special treatment. I mean,
right, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
The focus on rhetoric and then sort of more lenience on,
Exactly.
I guess, information that could lead to something like a hate crime. Like, be more proactive in that specific area, not just what people are saying.
Exactly. And I think it lets, I mean, the reason why the situation is like it is because it lets the government off the hook. It makes it easy. They just have to show a sign, send out these symbols of positive messages, and then their job is done.
Yeah, I think those are great suggestions about focusing on hate crimes or like preventing them specifically, and also the education aspect. I do think that Americans in general are very much more unaware of the rest of the world versus the rest of the world.
That's true. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think education would help, and also the media. But yeah, I don't think it's that much of a leap to be hoping some person with a lot of money can put some funding into a better media. And a lot of people, they will push their own ideas, but not try to foster. They will foster dialogue while pushing their own ideas, but I don't think they're actually focused on
the dialogue.
No. I don't think they're actually focused on. I don't want to use a really wishy-washy term, but healing that I think needs to occur because of all the polarization. I do think that's necessary, or it would be very helpful. So.
So you don't see the media playing a positive role?
No, I don't. I think it's too difficult. I think, like you were saying, there are commercial reasons.
Right.
And I think when you're super passionate about stuff, because I do think, I completely disagree with a lot of what people think, but I think because they're so passionate about it, they're blinded to the harm that they can be causing by being so passionate about it. So, no, I don't really have faith in, I have more faith in the media than the government, actually, but I don't have faith in the media. So, yeah. I don't think I have any more questions for you, and I think you really went through a lot, and thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask you if you had any questions or comments for me either, because I usually like to do that when someone comes.
Oh, great. That's a surprise.
You don't have to have any. You don't have to have any.
Sure, I mean, I'd just be curious about, I think you said something about your background, but what about your plans? I mean,
my plans.
Long-term, I suppose. What are your long-term ambitions?
My long-term ambitions are quite simple. I think I would like to remain in the US. That's not a given. I think that I would like to keep making the content that I'm making, focusing on this kind of social political commentary, but also I'm into crypto related stuff a lot. I don't know if you know, like Bitcoin, that kind of stuff. And then also, I'm an artist and I like to paint and I like to do those things. And I would just like to keep working on those things, and I would one day like to have a family as well. And those are pretty much my goals, which are, I think they're quite simple.
Great.
So yeah.
Well, good luck. I'll be watching your program in the future.
Oh, okay, great. That would be awesome. I was just realized I don't know if you meant like goals with my channel, and like because I was just talking about my life.
Yeah, actually, yes. Yeah, I'm curious about that too.
Okay, because I was just talking about my life, but goals with my channel. I think I would like to make more frequent content. I am in school and I have another semester, so I think my content is probably going to die down after summer, just for a couple months, like 4 months again for the fall. And then I would like to focus on research-based content, but also content that I think is quote-unquote healing and like helpful, even when I'm spreading my personal opinion out there. I want it to be like nice. Like there are people who say that I don't want to offend. Like, I've had like someone comment to me how I'm like kind of like I'm too wishy-washy and I don't want to offend people. But that's because I don't want to be a part of what's making social dialogue so vitriolic these days.
Yeah. So I know exactly what you mean. Awesome.
Yeah,
I think I mean it's the human connection that go. Yeah, I mean that's a cliche, but it's an important. It makes a difference.
I hope so. I tell myself that all the time, but it matters what I do, so I try to do the right thing, and I won't always get that right, but I'll try. So
great. Well, it was a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and anyone listening or watching, I would recommend going to look at holocaustRemembrance.com just to see what the definition is, even though I read it, and also the the list of examples that they gave in that document, just so you have proper context for what we were talking about. And you can also follow Rebecca on Twitter if you would like. It's RRGOULD.
Correct.
I think that's what it is. That's her handle. And she's also coming out with some paper. I think there's a paper you're coming out with soon.
Correct. On Islamophobia.
Right, and I think that would be interesting. Whether or not you agree with her politics, I think everyone.
I'm not. Yeah, I mean, I should say my own views have changed radically. I think by being in the U.S., the things I'm saying now I would never have said in the U.S. In fact, I was probably a bit blind to the importance of free speech while I was in the U.S. So I've changed as a result of that. So I'm happy. You know, I disagree with myself all the time. Happy to have disagreement with other people.
All right.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and thanks Desi-Rae for the interview.
You're welcome. If you like this discussion, do remember that this channel is fully supported by viewers and listeners like you. So you could make a donation at justthinkinoutloud.tv/donate. And you can also find this content on other channels outside of YouTube. There's a podcast. There are people who are probably listening to this right now. And I'm also on Gab and BitChute and other places. It's in my description. And you can also sign up for our newsletter at justthinkinoutloud.tv/newsletter. So just remember that as well. And thank you for listening or watching.